Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Ideas Seminar. Today, we are delighted to have Vidhya Ramalingam. I hope I didn't butcher it too badly.
That's right.
Here to talk to us. She's going to speak. She's the founder of Moonshot CVE, and Moonshot CVE is an organization that uses, advanced technology to actually intervene and to counter extremism. And they do this globally. In fact, their headquarters is in London. And she basically, at Moonshot CVE, she directs the overall strategy, oversees the campaigns, works on software, oversees software development and digital projects for over 25 different countries. Under her leadership, Moonshot has actually pioneered new partnerships with various tech companies to respond to violent extremism on their platforms, online intervention programs to pull individuals out of violent movements, and the use of automated messaging to disrupt hate groups online. Vidhya is recognized internationally for her role leading policy responses to white supremacists, extremism, and terrorism. Following the 2011 attacks in Norway, she actually led the EU's first inter-governmental initiative on white nationalist terrorism and extremism, initiated by the governments of Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and the Netherlands. And she also it was launched by the EU Commissioner for Home Affairs. She regularly advises big tech companies and heads of state on tackling white supremacy online, including people such as the Prime Minister of New Zealand and Norway. She has testified before the US Congress on the global threat posed by white nationalist terrorism, and she has served on the board of Life After Hate, an organization set up by former white supremacists to help individuals leave hate groups. In 2020, she was named an Obama leader by the Obama Foundation. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here in Vidhya. Absolutely thrilled to have you here, Vidhya. And please take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Dr. Carly. And thank you so much for the invitation to join you all today. So as mentioned, my name is Vidhya Ramalingam. I'm co-founder of Moonshot, and I'll start by giving you a bit of background on Moonshot and specifically what we do to understand and prevent the spread of violence online. So as Dr. Carly mentioned, we're an organization that works with governments, with tech companies, and more broadly with the international community to respond to online harms. And our core work started with responding to violent extremism and terrorism, and very much looking at this across ideologies. So from Islamist extremism through to white supremacy, through to in an Asian context, looking at Buddhist nationalist extremism or Hindu nationalist extremism in an Indian context. My background in particular started with the fight against white supremacist and far-right terrorism, and that was really my personal area of passion in setting up Moonshot. But over the years, as we started to roll out programs to respond to extremism and hate online, we started to see that this technology and some of the methods we were deploying had application across a broader spectrum of violent activity. So over the years, we have expanded our work to cover a range of online harms. So we deliver this work to understand and to intervene in gender-based violence, in human trafficking as it's facilitated online, in disinformation, including health-related disinformation, and other areas. But most of the examples I'm going to focus on today are really from our work on hate and extremism. And I thought I would start first with some context. Today, in 2021, individuals are posting, engaging, and accessing violent extremist content online at a really alarming rate. And the tech companies have been improving their efforts to moderate and to remove this terrorist content in particular. But this isn't enough on its own to stem violence. And this is for three reasons. The first reason is the large majority of violent extremist content may not actually be eligible for takedowns according to the terms of service and the policies of many of the tech companies, both large and small themselves. And oftentimes these groups, they walk the line. They know what will get them taken down. They walk the line and they do that incredibly well. But the second reason why it's not enough, why moderation is not enough, is when content is removed, the post or the video or the account is deleted, but not the individual who posted it. That person still exists and they might continue to repost online or to move to another platform, or they may be deeply vulnerable and pose a threat to the community around them. And the third reason why moderation is not enough on its own is there are still many spaces on the internet which are just not liable for takedowns and where this content can thrive. So this was a search that was entered into Google by an individual in the United States the day after the Christchurch attack in March 2019. That was an attack which left 51 people dead in New Zealand. Brenton Tarrant is the name of the perpetrator. This same search was replicated across the globe. We saw this search happen in New Zealand. We saw this search take place in Norway, across dozens of countries, across numerous languages, and across search engines. Moments like this, so moments which valorize terrorists, moments like this, a Google search, this is not liable for takedown. A Google search cannot be removed or blocked. And more often than not, when you search for violent extremist content on Google, it often presents as the top search results. So content moderation and removal is important, but it's not the solution to violent extremism online alone. And so when we set up Moonshot, we really set up with the intention to develop and to use technology, which would both help us understand the spread of violent extremism, but also to use the internet to proactively reach out to people and try and intervene. I should maybe just mention here, and I say with a caveat, that I am not a technologist. Most of my career has been dedicated to essentially the delivery of social work methods to pull people out of hate groups. My work has always been based on really the fundamental belief that change is possible, even for those that we think may be too far gone. And the internet presents a great opportunity for us to interact with people who are getting involved in hate groups and to try and basically plant the seeds for that change. And that's what Moonshot aims to do. We are now a team of nearly 50 based out of both London and DC and working really around the world. And it's a weird and wonderful mix of skills that we've brought together. We have software engineers and data scientists. We have a former detective on staff, a former mental health nurse practitioner, communications and marketing experts. We have human rights activists on board. And this unique blend of skills is what allows us to do our work. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how we find audiences who are at risk of violent extremism. Oops, sorry, I think I skipped ahead a bit too far. There we go. Let's see whether this will work. There we go. Individuals who are at risk of violent extremism, oftentimes they leave behind what I like to call a trail of clues in the online space. It's essentially a digital footprint that lets us know the path that they're taking. And oftentimes the clues that they leave us are publicly available clues. They're putting this in public spaces. So what we've done at Moonshot is we've developed databases of hundreds of thousands of online indicators of risk. These are the keywords and phrases that get used by these movements, the racial slurs they use, the propaganda they share, the music that they listen to, and content that glorifies their heroes. And we've built tools that can help us wade through publicly available data through public spaces online to find people that are leaving us that digital footprint, telling us that they are at risk of getting involved. Now, I want to show you some examples of how we build an evidence base around the scale of violent extremism and hate online. This is really the first step before we can deliver programming to respond. We want to make sure that any initiative we deliver online is evidence-based, and that it's not being driven by assumptions. And I mentioned earlier that Google search is essentially an unmoderated space. Google doesn't ban any searches. This is one of the reasons why we find search traffic data really useful in understanding the scale of the problem online. Another reason why it's useful is it's non-performative. It's not like social media where users are carefully crafting the way that they phrase something because they know they're sharing it with their networks or their family members. I think a lot of us tell our deepest, darkest secrets to Google. We often turn to Google in the moments where we don't want to talk to a friend or a family member about something. And so it's a particularly useful source of data to understand extremism and hate. And it's a space that people turn to access this content. Now, what you're seeing here is a county by county breakdown of attempts to access far-right extremist content across the United States in 2019. And you can see some example search terms included in the top right corner there. But these are the sorts of things that people across the US are entering into Google on a daily basis. In 2019, we tracked nearly 1 million attempts to access content that was affiliated with far-right extremism. So that was in 2019 alone. Now, we just released, and this is available on our website, if you're interested, we just released data from 2020 to 2021. We released state-by-state one-pagers breaking down this data at the county level. It's available at our website, moonshotcve.com, and happy to share links through the event organizers today. But I did just want to mention that there is some more up-to-date data available if anyone's interested in wading through that. And at the start of the pandemic last year, we tracked, in particular, across the US, we tracked a 37% increase in attempts to access white supremacist content on search. Now, I say that because I want to mention that far-right extremist movements, they thrive on moments of crisis. And for white supremacists in particular, their ideology is premised on this idea that a race war is coming. So crises are moments where we typically see extremist actors really grasping to turn that fear and anxiety in society into an opportunity for them to break things down in society. And the pandemic provided that opportunity, along with multiple concurrent crises taking place over the last year. And now, a year on from the pandemic, what we've seen is an increase now in 140% higher levels of engagement with white supremacy content on search, as opposed to pre-pandemic levels. So really just we're seeing an unprecedented scale of hate online and attempts to engage with hate content online. Here you can see how this trend was experienced across the globe. This is all data from last year. It's data from the immediate month after the start of the pandemic. So I believe it's from around March, April. And as we were all online more, hate actors were online more too. In countries where we've been building longitudinal data sets, it's also been possible for us to assess essentially spikes and escalations in behavior online as a result of any event or incident which takes place offline. In nearly every geographical context that we look at this, we tend to see engagement with extremist content spike in the immediate aftermath following violent events. Now, I wanted to show you one example of this. This is data from the weeks following August 3rd, 2019, the attack on a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. This was an attack that was by a white nationalist who had been inspired by Christchurch. We were able to map a 54% increase in attempts to access white supremacist content online nationwide across the US in the immediate aftermath of that attack. In particular, there was a 495% increase in attempts to access content violent towards Jewish communities, and an 82 and 83% increase in attempts to access content violent towards Black and Mexican communities. We tend to see this trend after every attack. So if I look back in time and tell you a bit about 2018, following the attack on a synagogue in Pittsburgh, we were able to identify a 92% increase in attempts to access white supremacy content in the week following that attack. And likewise, in 2017, following the Charlottesville incident, we saw a 400% increase in attempts to access this content online. And really worrying, what we tend to see is that we don't return back to normal engagement levels following those incidences. In some cases, the baseline resets higher year on year following every attack. And that's in addition to some of the data that I mentioned to you around the impact of the pandemic. So we are in a moment in American history where there is heightened activity and heightened engagement with hate online. Now, I want to move on to solutions. I don't just want to leave you with the problem. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do to reach out to these audiences online. Once we find them, what do we do? And I should say up front, we are not a research organization. So any data analytics work we're doing, any work we're doing to understand the audience is all for the purpose of us directly engaging those audiences online and delivering prevention programming with them. So how do we use that data to reach people who are at risk of violence? Well, there are several tiers of programming that we use to try and reduce the risk posed by hate actors online. These are 4 options that you're seeing here. And in the interest of time, I'm going to really focus on the final 3 here. And I want to tell you a bit about what we're currently testing and what's working and what we're learning about how best to engage these audiences online. So we do a lot of work which falls into the safeguarding space. So we run global prevention and safeguarding campaigns to reach users that are at risk of violent extremism and offer them safer alternatives. One example, we partnered with Google several years ago to repurpose advertising technology to reach violent extremists with content which discredits these ideologies and which offers alternatives. And how does this work? Essentially, what we're doing is we're repurposing tools that were developed for commercial purposes, and we're using them for social good. So for example, when someone searches for right-wing extremist content, the very first piece of content that they will see will be a safer alternative. Sometimes that's content which tries to deconstruct an extremist narrative. Sometimes it's connecting them in even with a service or a kind of program that they can engage with in the longer term. The aim here is really to ensure that every person searching for hate content is given the choice to consume a safer alternative. And ideally, we want to give them content that will keep them engaged, that will plant seeds of doubt, and that will grant them the possibility for long-term change. This is a method that we deliver globally, and the main objective is really to, as I said, ensure there's a safer option available to those who are seeking out harmful content. But increasingly, as I mentioned, we're not only connecting users with a safer alternative, we're also connecting them in with local services so that they can access and engage with services that might help them turn their lives around. There are learnings which come from really decades of offline prevention and intervention models which need to be applied online. There's research from Scandinavia and from Germany over the past decade, which has really evidenced the efficacy of one-to-one counseling and social work interventions with right-wing extremists. What we do as an organization at Moonshot is that we work to apply those same social work methods in the digital space. And this can be done through a whole range of different mechanisms. What we do is we offer these individuals psychosocial service content online through videos, manuals, sometimes it's self-help guides. It can also be done through signposting them directly to a service provider. So for example, to an online or an offline chat with a counselor, a hotline to call, an immediate person at the end of a phone who can talk them down from potentially getting involved in violence. We've even run programs in which social workers directly reach out to internet users and proactively start conversations if they're posting violent content. Now, in our global tests, we consistently find that far-right extremists are disproportionately likely to engage with offers of assistance when offered online. We found, and this particular finding that you see on the screen here, this is from the United States 3 years ago, we found that far-right extremists were 48% more likely to engage with essentially self-help and social service content than the general public. So we ran this with a general public control group. We also found that if individuals were looking to join a violent group like the KKK, they were 115% more likely than the general public to engage with this self-help content. So this is the sort of evidence base that underpins some of our work in this space. I should also mention that we've tested this globally. We've tested this in very different contexts. And in Indonesia, we ran an experiment where we tested traditional ideological counter-narrative content with audiences that were getting involved in violent groups online. We also then tested psychosocial support content. And audiences engaging with violent groups online were 128% more likely to engage with the psychosocial content than with the ideological counter content. And just to be really clear, what I mean by ideological counter content is content which directly undermines the ideology, directly addresses the ideology, or tries to discredit the ideology. So they were more likely to engage if we offered them something which was more focused around their emotional state and working with them to de-escalate them from violence. Now, we're currently delivering what I'm still calling crisis messaging campaigns across the US. We've been doing this since before the election, after the election, through the January 6th events at the US Capitol. And what we're finding is very similar to our historical results here. We tend to find the kinds of messages that work with these audiences are messages that ask, again, these are individuals that are getting involved in right-wing extremism online or white supremacy online. We tend to find that messaging asking them to pause and reflect on their choices or telling them that their choices matter, that tends to work. We also tend to find that messages connecting them in with psychosocial support in times of crisis tend to be effective. And we also find that messaging which appeals to their ties to their immediate loved ones, to their neighbors, to their family members, appealing to those ties also seems to work. So while it's really tempting to meet hate and disinformation with counterfacts and getting into ideological debates with them or telling them that they're wrong, we tend to find that it's far more effective to engage with these audiences through essentially social work. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more detail about the US crisis campaigns that we've been running and a bit about the approach we're taking. We've focused on 4 audiences, and these campaigns have been running now for well over 7 months. 4 audiences that we focused on have been white supremacist, armed group members, QAnon adherents, and people consuming anti-government conspiracy theories. Now, some of the messages that you see here are, again, they're very much focused on de-escalating someone from violence. They very much aim to take someone who's hyped up, who's angry, and to ask them to pause and really reflect. So it's not about getting into ideological debates with them. Our main aim for these campaigns is to de-escalate someone from violence. Just by way of example, I wanted to show you a sample of one of the hotlines that we set up. So this is a hotline that we set up dedicated for those 4 audiences. So again, for white supremacists, armed group members, QAnon, and conspiracy theorists. By way of example, around the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, around that day itself, we offered crisis counseling to more than 270,000 internet users that were engaging with armed group and white supremacist content around that day. We've had over 70,000 engagements with this campaign, and we should soon be able to report on the data around the longer term efficacy of this, around the counseling conversions that have taken place. But I thought I'd share some initial figures, and these are just as of a couple months ago. The campaigns are still ongoing, but just some initial findings. We've had campaigns live across Twitter, across YouTube, across Google Search, and across the Google Display Network. And the first point I want to mention here is that the numbers you see around impressions, and impressions are the number of times that someone who has accessed hate content online or has sought to access hate content online, this is the number of times that they've seen one of our advertisements. Now, the first point I want to make here is that these numbers are huge. So for those of you who might be familiar with Moonshot's work, we are used to reaching small numbers of audience members. We're dealing with violent extremism, right? So we're not dealing with mass movements here. Now, what makes these numbers huge? Well, our audience is still very focused. It's all behaviorally driven. So our ads are only reaching people who have searched, watched, or engaged with at-risk content. So armed group content, white supremacist content, QAnon, or disinformation content. But again, impressions should not be confused with numbers of people. So this does not mean that there are 86.4 million people who are consuming that content. Again, this is just the number of times that someone who engaged with this content online saw our ad. And what we're doing here is we're essentially following people around the internet based on their engagement with hate content. We're showing them these ads at other points in their journey online. But the numbers are still huge and for us really unprecedented for us as an organization. The bottom right-hand number there it's just interesting. Some of the at-risk audience that we're reaching with our campaigns are sharing our de-escalation content amongst themselves. And that's just been a fascinating trend. For us, it indicates an appetite for the content we're serving them, that they're willing to share this content within their wider networks. And again, our messaging has been focused around de-escalation. And across all the platforms that we run campaigns, the most engaging ad that we ran began with the statement, "Anger and grief can be isolating." So on average, those 4 audiences that we were reaching, they were 17% more likely to click on that message than any of the others that we tested. And in particular, armed group audiences engaged most with what we call calm messaging and also what I'd call American identity messaging. So American identity, there's an example of that on the top right of the screen. It's very much about positive patriotism and harnessing the desire to be patriotic into constructive behaviors and positive behaviors for our communities. And then on the bottom right, you see an example of the calm messaging. The calm messaging that we tested was really around asking people to just take a beat and asking them to just pause and think about their actions. Some of that messaging said things like, don't do something you'll regret. Self-control is key. We even offered mindfulness exercises to de-escalate people from anger. And interestingly, QAnon audiences engage the most with what I'd call empathy anger ads. So ads which said, are you feeling angry? You're not alone. Learn how to escape the anger and move forward. So it's a general finding that has run through our work over the last 3 years and then through this crisis period in the US, that we just consistently find that messaging which taps into the emotional state of individuals getting involved in violent groups tend to be more effective. Now, one of the reasons why we're so interested in how essentially self-help and psychosocial support content is resonating, in particular with QAnon audiences, is as QAnon is fragmenting and as disillusion is rising within QAnon, as audiences are realizing that the prophecies that they were sold were false, we are tracking the fraying mental health of so many of those audience members, people who have lost their jobs, who lost their connections with their loved ones, who, by buying into these lies, have found themselves alienated from everyone they know and love. We've seen expressions of extreme anxiety coming from these audiences online, and we've even seen the heightened expressions of suicidal thought, which is really worrying. So this is one of the reasons why we'll continue to have a focus on psychosocial support, and we'll continue to monitor impact over time. And with that, I'm going to leave that there and turn things over for questions.
To everyone on the thing, it's fine if you just speak out with your question, or you can raise your hand and we can call on you. And I'll take the prerogative of asking the first question. As you collect data from Google, like what are they searching, search data, there's many reasons for searching for that content that don't involve being, interested in joining one of the groups or engaging in hate speech or yourself. Is it critical? Would it be helpful to your mission to be able to segment out why people were searching for it? And do you try to do that?
It's a great question. We do everything we can to try and distinguish between levels of intent with searches. Now, we do everything we can, but I think there's a level of ambiguity here that we will never be able to fully break down, and that's because the strings of text that individuals are entering into Google are oftentimes very vague, and oftentimes don't tell us exactly the motivation for the search. What we try and do is distinguish between searches which are purely informational. So if someone is entering into Google KKK on its own, that would not be a search that we constitute as being at risk of violent extremism, because it could just be someone searching for information about the KKK because they are learning about it in a history class, or because they read about it in the news and they want to know what it is. If someone is searching for information about how to join the KKK, or about how to contact or donate to the KKK, that would register as a higher risk search and would be something that we would constitute as potentially someone who's at risk of violent extremism. But we accept that there is always going to be a level of ambiguity here. Our data may capture some researchers, it may capture folks in this group who are deeply interested in this subject matter and doing much more informed research. But we do everything we can to try and disaggregate between levels of risk.
Like I said, please feel free to just go ahead and call out your question.
Hi, yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah, thanks for the talk. It was really great. I just had a small question. Like, was the data in the last few slides from only US interventions, or do you also perform interventions elsewhere in the world?
Yes, the data in the last few slides that I presented is entirely from the US, and it's from campaigns which have been running over the last 6 or 7 months or so, since just before the election. We do run campaigns globally. We run campaigns to reach out not only to neo-Nazi audiences in places like America and Canada, but we also run campaigns to reach out to, for example, Buddhist violent extremists in contexts like Sri Lanka or Myanmar, again, with similar types of methodologies that we're testing. So our organization is very global in remit. There tends to be similarities across the globe in terms of what content is most effective with audiences that are at risk of violence. And again, in almost every geography we test, we tend to find that messaging that really taps into the emotional state of individuals tends to be the most effective.
Thank you for the answer.
I have a question. So I think you had mentioned that you work with Twitter and Google and like different platforms. Do you try and identify users across the platforms, or just work with the platforms to focus on their users only?
So we do work, some of our work is in partnership with the tech companies. Some of our work is on platforms, but not delivered in partnership with the tech companies. So we do both. When we work directly with, for example, Facebook, our work will be focused on Facebook exclusively and on audiences that are organizing hate activities through Facebook. The work that we do with other international partners, whether they're governments or whether they're NGOs, are very much cross-platform. And to bring up again the question that was raised previously, depending on the country, the relevant platform will be different. So there are some countries where the most relevant platforms will be very mainstream platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. There will be other countries where much more niche platforms or even country-specific platforms are going to be most relevant. So we'll choose the platforms of focus depending on the geographical context.
That makes sense. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Actually, I have two questions, if you allow me. The first one is, can you break down the or categorize the audience gender for age, and to know who's, if we try to design programs or project to address these groups, just to know, to focus on youth, on adults, also for gender. The second question is about the language. You are like search for content in English. What about the Arabic content, especially that, especially Middle East and also in Europe and United States, there is a high number of Arabs there. Thank you.
Yeah, great questions. We do, in particular with search data, I should mention here that we don't get access to IP addresses. There is no PII, personally identifiable information, that we get from Google when we're looking at search data. But we do get metadata, so we are able to break down searches based on age and gender as and when that data has been self-reported by users to Google. And what we tend to find when it comes to neo-Nazi audiences in particular, if we look across the United States, Canada, the Nordic countries, Australia, and New Zealand, on average, we tend to find that the audience is around 75% male and around 25% female. The age spread is, it's not clustered around youth. And I should mention that we don't get data around under 18s. So all of our data is focused on 18 and above. But we tend to find that roughly 50% of the audience sits below the age of around 45, and roughly 50% of the audience tends to be above 45. So we see a pretty wide distribution of ages, and that's specifically on neo-Nazi, white supremacist, far-right content. To your second question about language, the examples that I gave were entirely from the United States context, looking at neo-Nazi and far-right and extremist and domestic violent extremist content. Most of that work we do in English, but you're absolutely right. When we're running programs in different countries, we will always be running those programs in the local language. So the work that we do in the Middle East and North Africa will be in Arabic or in relevant languages. The work that we do in the Maldives, for example, will be in the language Dhivehi. The work that we do in India will be, depending on the state, in the local language for that state. So it is all geographically and contextually specific.
Thank you.
Hi, are you able to measure, you were mentioning the idea of measuring the impressions or the amount of clicks in terms of the kind of self-help and the social psychological kind of intervention that you're trying to push to people. Are you able to see, or how clearly are you able to see whether or not people go from their first searches to what you're promising back to what they originally were doing, or if they continue, like, to see like their trends and how they're behaving? Is that part of what you're measuring, or and then how does that work, and how is that going? Yes.
Unfortunately, with Google search, we don't have access to data around what users go on to consume on Google afterwards. I wish I did, because it would be a fascinating data set to understand impact. So oftentimes with those campaigns where we're running campaigns on Google, we're sometimes very humble in terms of what our objectives are for those campaigns. Our main aim is to increase the amount of time that we get someone to spend on safer alternative content. So then that's especially the objective when we're just offering a static piece of content. So if it's for example, a direct counter narrative, something that dismantles the ideology, or a self-help guide, that's a one-off engagement where we want to keep them engaged for as long as possible, but then we don't have a sense of what they go on to do afterwards. One of the great benefits of running programs where we can connect users in with services is that you can access much more interesting information around what that user gets out of the initiative in the longer term. So this is where, as we're increasingly offering counseling interventions with audience members engaging with this content, we'll be looking very closely at the counseling conversion rate. So how many people not only land on the website, but then go on to undertake a counseling session, and how many people come back for a repeat counseling session after their first one. And that's where you can get much more interesting metrics around long-term engagement. Now, on other social media platforms, there are sometimes opportunities for us to assess the individual change on an individual level. We've just come off the back of running an experiment in Sri Lanka, where we're looking at audience members that were engaging with Buddhist violent extremist content in Sri Lanka. And we have delivered interventions on Twitter. We just now have some data that we'll look to publish in the next couple weeks. So I'm very happy to keep in touch with anyone interested. We just have some data which is actually statistically significant, which has proven that our intervention, which was delivered through individual messaging, reaching out to individual Twitter users, we've just proven that our treatment group, the group that received the intervention, are posting content, hate content, at a lower rate than they were prior to the intervention. And we tested that against a control group. And the results, as I mentioned, were statistically significant. So we're doing everything we can now to start to build up the evidence base around the impact on an individual level, but it's not always possible depending on the platform and depending on what data we have access to. We also, we as a European organization have to be GDPR compliant. So we're compliant with the data regulation laws of the European Union. And what that means is, we hold ourselves to very high data privacy standards, and that sometimes comes with limitations around what data you can access to really assess long-term efficacy. But we're working around that.
That's great. That sounds really interesting. And I guess if I'm allowed a second question, somewhat similar to that, or the worries about kind of the things that you can't measure, is there seems to be, at least in some of the political spaces, especially in the United States, this kind of this combination of some of the kind of misinformation, disinformation, or violent extremist kind of talking, and distrust of tech companies. And so I don't know if the trend is going to be going forward, more DuckDuckGo, less Google, those kind of things. And I'm wondering what your organization has thought about those kind of changes and how you might deal with those.
We definitely see, the symbiotic relationship between the tech companies and extremist, niche extremist communities online. We tend to see, whatever action the major tech companies take will impact how these niche groups organize online. In the last couple of years, we've seen a kind of mass migration of those audiences towards towards unmoderated platforms, much more niche platforms, the kind of Gabs of this world, 4chans, 8kuns. And those spaces provide a pretty rich environment for these audiences to speak freely without any repercussions of their activities. So for an organization like ours, we have migrated along with those audiences, and so we're doing increasing work on those platforms. It's not to say we're not doing work on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and the big platforms. They still remain a high priority for us, especially given that those are the spaces where extremist content is most likely to come to interface with mainstream audiences, and it can do a lot of damage, even if there aren't high volumes of extremists on those platforms. But yes, we tend to follow these groups where they go, which means sometimes we're doing work on very niche platforms that many people have not heard of.
Great, thank you.
Okay, hi. Thank you for the great work you're doing. I have a question about the database that you use to search for keywords that identify extremist groups. So you started by saying that you have a huge database. So I'm just wondering, how did you build this database, or you go on all the time changing or updating the database? Do you have like informants? Do you have domain expertise, like maybe people who were identified with extreme groups before, and then they come and join you and tell you about the different words they use? And is it all based on keyword searches, or are there other types of searches you do that is not just relying on certain keywords that appear? So I'd appreciate you elaborate on this, please.
Yep, great question. So we've built up our database organically over the last 5 years now, and it's a database that spans ideologies. So it includes Islamist extremism, Buddhist extremism, a whole range of different types of extremisms in there. And again, across languages, I think we have maybe around 20 plus languages included in our database. We have built up the database through essentially a 3-tiered process in any country where we're doing this work. The first is that we will workshop terms with experts, with both the research community, but also with former extremists, where those individuals are available and are a resource to us. And so we'll directly workshop the initial terms and the initial indicators, as we call them, with those experts. The second method that we use to build the database is we'll directly mine extremist sources. So we'll take extremist texts, the propaganda that they share, the videos that they share, and we'll mine those sources for the language that we should be including. Some of that is done or facilitated in an automated fashion. So we are using natural language processing to do some of that. Some of it is a very human process of our analysts just immersing themselves and directly mining for the terminology they should be using. And then the third method that we use to build this out is we pull directly from some of the tech companies which provide us with basically kind of predictive suggestions around related terms. The best way of describing this is when you start to enter something into Google, Google will often fill in the rest of the keyword search for you based on terms that are commonly used in that context. We basically try and pull from the tech companies predicted or suggested or trending phrases that relate to our initial database of extremist indicators. And again, we are focusing on really high risk indicators here. So we are not looking to include anything which is just about kind of social deviance more broadly, or about even radical ideas or behaviors. That is not included in our database. We are really focusing on violence, the violent part of violent extremism. So we're very focused in what we include in that database and what we don't include in that database. And then your question about what's included, is it just text? Our starting point was very much keywords and phrases. Over time, we've started to build that database to include links, to include music that gets shared. So we do actually have a white nationalist, white supremacist music database. We have a violent jihadist anashid database. We have databases now of multimedia content, which would fall into our at-risk category. We are now working up an image database as well, although our technology around image identification is a little bit more nascent.
Great, thank you. And just a follow up, so is there a process through which you update your database? Like, do you regularly do this? Like, I understand the trending for sure, this is a kind of update, but is there any other process through which you do this 3-tiered approach, and because things change over time, so.
Absolutely. In countries where we have projects live and where we have the resourcing to do it, we change our database on a daily basis. And that's not just adding new terminology and sometimes even removing terminology. If there is a piece of extremist content where the word has now been mainstreamed for another reason, that would be a reason to downgrade the risk level of a term in our database or to remove it entirely. So sometimes we're adding keywords or removing them. We're also sometimes changing the risk level associated with any of our keywords. The way that our database is coded, it's coded by a whole range of different variables, including risk level. And there will be terms which might be high risk on one day, but which change in risk level based on the context, or terms which were once low risk, but suddenly become high risk because they've started to be used by extremist movements in a more threatening way. So we're updating that where possible, even on a daily basis. But again, that sometimes depends on our resourcing available to us.
Sure, thank you. Great.
Hi, thank you for the great work Moonshot are doing. My question is about the de-escalation content that you talked about. So you mentioned about 89 million impressions and about 80,000 clicks on de-escalation content. I wanted to understand, what kind of de-escalation content do you share? Second is, you mentioned like counseling services. So what is the click-through rate or the rate of people going for counseling through those out of those 800,000 who clicked on the de-escalation content? And is this de-escalation content usually text message only, or is it video also? And if it is video also, then do you also look at what the engagement of the video was, whether the full video was watched or whether the video was shut down in a few seconds of opening it? And you also have a team to create this content in-house.
I am really sorry, but I didn't hear a few aspects of the question. I'm wondering if maybe you might be able to type it, because I think I only caught a part of that question.
Yes, Parsoon, if you could drop your question in the chat so we can thoroughly answer.
Sure. Is my voice better now?
No.
It still sounds like you're underwater. Yeah.
Yep.
I thought I might be able to catch enough of the question to start answering, but I don't think I caught any of it. So I'll wait until the question appears in the chat.
Okay.
Just checking once again if my voice is better now.
That's a bit clearer, but it's still hard to hear.
Okay.
Yeah, just type it in.
Can I go ahead with the question like while he's typing it in? If that's fine. So basically my question is like from the opposite perspective, right? Like from the perspective of, let's say, QAnon or like stuff like that, right? So have they devised strategies to get around you, right? Like you as an organization are potentially taking their members, and have they tried devising strategies around it? And also my second question is, especially in areas where governments are spreading misinformation, let's say India, right? So our ruling government is spreading misinformation here. So have they tried to act against you, or like basically like how do you deal with that?
Excellent question. In terms of groups like QAnon and the extremist audiences that we're reaching out to, we have seen on occasion chatter in extremist spaces about some of our more high-profile initiatives. So we every now and then will pick up on those audiences, just dropping news articles about what we're doing. That said, I don't think we're important enough. I wish I could say that what we were doing was so important to them that they would focus on trying to undermine us. But unfortunately, fortunately, we have not been in a position where we've, experienced any sort of targeted attack or strategy to get around us or strategy to undermine us. Now, it's something we look out for and we do regular monitoring for, where we want to be prepared for if that happens in the future, but we haven't seen anything like that to date. And then in terms of contexts where governments themselves are part of the problem, when we deliver work in those contexts, we are not working with the local government in countries like that. We're oftentimes working with the international community. We might be working with the tech companies, or sometimes we might be investing in the work ourselves. We operate as a social enterprise, which gives us a lot of scope to invest sometimes in the programs that we don't necessarily see the international community investing in. Some of the work that we first did on Hindu nationalist extremism was self-financed work. We couldn't find funders for it, and so we just went ahead and did it ourselves. Likewise, 5 years ago, some of our work on white supremacy in the United States was self-financed work until we could get to the point where we found enough partners that were willing to resource this work and sustain it. So we have, again, fortunately not been in a position where we've been targeted by governments who are trying to undermine our work, but it is something that we prepare ourselves for. We recognize that our work will sometimes be seen as controversial depending on the country that we're delivering the programming.
Thank you.
I haven't seen anything come up in the chat yet, so if someone else has another question, go ahead. Oh, me. Yeah, so Vidya, here's Prasoon's question. So questions is about the kind of de-escalation or intervention content you share. And there's 3 questions here. So is this text or links or video content? Do you measure engagement with the de-escalation content, for example, the percentage of video watched? And do you have an in-house team to tailor the content to specific countries and groups?
That's great. I'm glad you typed the question, because I thought it was an entirely different question when I heard you before. So in terms of the kinds of content that we're offering these audiences, it's multimedia. Sometimes it's a static text resource that they can download. Sometimes it's videos. We use a lot of video content from across the globe. And sometimes it's directly linking them into a service. So we have linked people into an actual chat with a counselor. And we've linked people into a one-to-one conversation with a social worker. So it just depends on the program. And it also depends on what's culturally relevant for the geography that we're delivering the program. In terms of measuring engagement with the de-escalation content, if it's video content that we are sending audiences to, then we look at metrics like, it's everything from how many people actually see the ad, through to how many people click on the link, through to how many people actually stay on the video when we send them there, through to the number of minutes that they spend watching the video on average. There are a whole range of metrics that we look at if it's video content. If it's a static website, then we will also get some general, just basically Google Analytics data around what audience members do when they land on a website, whether they immediately bounce and go somewhere else, or how much time they spend there, what they click on the website. And then if it's a service that we're offering, we then will get metrics around their engagement with that service offering. How many people actually call through to a hotline? How many people actually engage in a one-on-one chat with a counselor? And then we start to look, if it's a service offering, we start to look at repeat engagement. How many people come back for another session? How many people engage with the program in the longer term? There are a number of programs we're now working with in the United States to try and understand and measure longer term, the kind of facilitative facilitation of audiences from the online space into a longer term program. We have a partnership now with Life After Hate, and they provide exit services to pull people out of neo-Nazi groups. We have a program with them live right now to measure the efficacy of channeling online audiences into their exit program, and that'll involve much more longer term measurement around efficacy and engagement, both with the digital content we give them and also with the offline service. And then the third question here, do you have an in-house team to tailor the content to specific countries and groups? It depends on the context. We do have some country experts on our team for some of the geographies that we work in, but in any projects, we are always working with local partners, just like we're working in the United States with organizations like Life After Hate, with organizations that have deep expertise on the ground of how these sorts of groups mobilize. In any country that we deliver these programs with, we are working with organizations like that, that both have the expertise, that have the skills, that have the direct engagement experience with these audiences. We see ourselves as a technical partner to those organizations. So what we do is we take organizations that are equipped to deal with this problem offline in their geography, and we work with them to digitize their work and get their work out to audience members who might be at risk of violence.
I can ask a quick question. My question is, how has your need to comply with GDPR from a data privacy perspective constrained your work, or maybe it did not? I'm just curious about this angle and how you work around data privacy constraints. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question. I see GDPR as an opportunity rather than a constraint for us to do work with a higher ethical standard and higher level of kind of concern around data privacy for the audiences that we engage with. So we started Moonshot right around the time where we knew that GDPR was going to come online within the next few years, because we started the organization in 2015. Any technology that we built or any methodologies that we built from day one were GDPR compliant, because we knew we would need to be. That said, I think it was a great incentive for us up front at the very start of the organization to be thinking about ethics and privacy and the rights of audiences that we're engaging with as we were building, as we were designing. And so I see it as a strength of ours, that it's something that we take very seriously, that we've baked into everything we do as an organization. We have an internal ethics committee that that any of our staff can raise ethical concerns to. That committee is independent from myself and my co-founder, and concerns get escalated through that committee and get put to myself and Ross if there are any internal concerns. We also subject ourselves to an ethical audit by an external organization. So we've actually just recently published our ethics audit for 2020 on our website, and that's something that we do on an annual basis. And then we also have data privacy team internally that works with every single project to ensure that they're all doing data privacy impact assessments for any new piece of work, that they are not only compliant with GDPR, but also meeting our own internal standards around ethics and do no harm principles. So I see it as a strength rather than a constraint. That said, I'm certain there are lots of things that we don't do as an organization, which for example, some American organizations might do because they don't need to be GDPR compliant. But for us, it's never been a problem for us to do our work, and I think it keeps us accountable.
Thank you.
We're coming up on the last minutes here. Are there any final questions? It doesn't sound like it. And it looks like Dr. Carly just went to her class to get started at 4. So I just want to say thank you to you, Vidhya, for this amazing, informative talk, and wonderful to hear about what Moonshot is doing and the impact you're having around the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the questions, really important questions. Thank you, everyone.